Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I know that Reddit is not exactly the most popular place on the internet. It's a bit of a contradiction. Everybody seems to use it at least a little bit, and yet everyone seems to also think it's a terrible website. And I kind of understand why. Like most board services, even though Reddit is not an open bulletin board service like you might have found on a website in the early 2000s, Reddit has the problem that it is sort of open to the public. You can join up and anyone can post, and as long as you meet some basic standards of behavior and you don't get a mod pissed off at you, you can keep posting. There's a saying that 90% of everything is terrible, 9% of the remaining 10 are okay, and only 1% is really good. And when you have a population as big as the entire internet, as has access to Reddit and seems to use it on some days, well, you're going to get a lot of terrible stuff on Reddit, and that can range from terrible takes to terrible people to terrible writing. It's just one of the dangers that exists when there are no gatekeepers. You're going to get a lot of stuff, and most of it's going to be bad, because that's the way things tend to work. So it may seem odd when I say that a Reddit subforum called r/NoSleep is at the bleeding edge of restoring classical storytelling, the story circle, where the entire community is a part of telling the story, both in receiving the story and in sharing it with others. But that is in fact the case. r/NoSleep is a place for people to tell spooky stories, all told with the conceit that they are being told by a person who actually had the events happen to them. So rather than being told in a third-person perspective about kids who are wandering through a forest, you might get the memories of an adult man who lost all his friends when he was a kid walking through a forest. Everyone who posts to the board maintains this fiction as a part of facilitating the storytelling experience. A very good example of this from recent history is the story of Nathan Rogers, the helmsman on the Point of No Return, a fishing vessel that sinks somewhere in the ocean and whose crew finds themselves stranded on an abandoned and haunted ship that will not let them leave. The post is written as if the fictional Mr. Rogers is communicating to the people of Reddit, asking for advice and telling them what happens. After each post, he went through the comments, replied to a few, and then in the next installment of the story, actually executed on some suggestions that commenters made, or explained why those suggestions were not going to work under the circumstances the crew was under. It's a very fascinating bit of storytelling, and it reminds me a little bit of the kind of call and response you often see in some of the ancient storytelling traditions. The Passover meal, for example, recounts the history of the Jews up until the Passover, and then children in the audience have a set of questions that they ask the elders who are telling the story. This brings out some of the symbolic meaning and some of the details that aren't covered in the first recitation. In time, the children who ask these questions will become the elders who answer them. This, in its most simple form, is the story circle. People who hear a story eventually repeat it for the benefit of others. The basic conceit of r/NoSleep takes this concept and evolves it. It gives people an opportunity to participate in the story in a very hands-on way, to ask questions and see if they can get more information that they might not have under other circumstances. This is something that was probably quite commonplace in traditional storytelling, when you had one person telling a story to a bunch of other people, maybe sitting around a campfire or sharing a meal. And, when you're telling a story about your life, that kind of storytelling still exists. But the very sterile and unchanging nature of modern storytelling, where a story is just put out in a book or in a pre-recorded film, cuts off that avenue of storytelling. Now, it has a lot of other advantages, obviously. Physical media has taken over the storytelling landscape for good reason. But it has cut off other parts of good storytelling. And that communal aspect where people are drawn into the story, where they examine the parts and they come to understand them, until eventually they are ready to bring those parts to someone else, that is gone from most places. But we're starting to see it again in the internet age. r/NoSleep is not the only place to do this. The SCP files, with their found document style and their very simple but very flexible approach to writing a secure containment protocol makes it very easy for a person to read a few entries and get an understanding of how to create their own SCP entry. You think up a dangerous phenomena, or a dangerous creature, or even a dangerous object. You assign it a number, and then you describe how you prevent it from being known to the wider public, how you keep it securely contained. Maybe you include a little information about how these things were discovered, both the object or phenomena itself and the correct way to contain it, and maybe you speculate a little bit on its history, or tell how people have experimented with it. Voila! You have an SCP entry, and a pretty interesting story to go along with it, if you've done your job right. Again, there is an obvious flaw to this. There is no gatekeeper to ensure quality. That was, at least in theory, the role of editors and publishers in the traditional publishing industry. But they're really not doing their job very well right now. And the overall quality that you can expect from a professionally published work has dropped. So we may be better off investigating these new cutting-edge ways to tell stories and building up the kinds of story circles that keep these stories perpetuating themselves, hopefully iterating to higher and higher levels of quality, rather than just going to traditional publishing and hoping we can beat our head against that until it becomes good again. Exactly how high the quality level of the traditional publishing industry ever was is, well, frankly, an entirely different question. Now, obviously, there are other problems with a place like our NoSleep. NoSleep is a place for creepypastas, which, as the name implies, are generally light horror stories. They're not the most inventive things out there. They do tend to rely on some repeated tropes, and after you've read a few, you can generally tell where they're going to go. Although, admittedly, you do occasionally find some pretty good ones, either in setting a mood or in creating a twist that you really didn't see coming. Again, 90% terrible, 9% average, 1% good. It would be nice if there was room for other similar communities out there, and there may be some on Reddit. Our NoSleep is just the most famous one and the one that I stumbled across first. I really haven't branched too far out into other potential avenues for this kind of storytelling, at least not yet. But what I'm seeing right now is more and more people engaging with the art of crafting a story, even if they're not doing it as their full-time calling, even if they're not pursuing it as the be-all and end-all, they're keeping a hand in. And I think that's healthier than having just a handful of full-time storytellers and a general populace who doesn't think about storytelling at all. Hopefully, over time, this trend grows, and we start to see people thinking about the nature of good stories once again. Let me know if you've seen any place like our NoSleep that covers other genres down in the comments below. I would love to go and check them out. While you're down there, there's a like button and a subscribe button. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.